By 1942, the Pacific had turned into a graveyard. The Japanese Empire had swept across Asia and the Pacific Islands, capturing tens of thousands of Allied soldiers, Americans, British, Australians, Dutch, and Filipinos. These men, once part of proud armies, were now prisoners of war, stripped of weapons, names, and hope. For the Japanese military, prisoners were not soldiers to be respected. They were shameful beings, men who had dishonored themselves by surrendering, and in the eyes of Japan's wartime command, they were resources to be used, not humans to be protected. As Japan's empire expanded, so did its hunger for labor. Mines, docks, and factories across the home islands demanded workers, and Japan's own men were dying at the front. The solution was brutal and simple. Ship the POWs across the seas to work as slaves. The destinations were thousands of kilometers away: Nagasaki, Kyushu, Korea, even Manchuria. The prisoners would travel by sea, packed into cargo holds on merchant freighters. The Japanese called them special transports. The prisoners called them something else: hell ships. Most of these vessels were not military. They were rusted cargo ships, never meant to carry human lives. Yet the Japanese army filled their dark holds with hundreds, sometimes thousands of men. Each ship was a floating dungeon. POWs were forced below deck into compartments barely large enough to stand in. The air was suffocating, the heat unbearable. There was no light, no toilets, and almost no food. The smell of sweat, vomit, and death clung to the metal walls. Men fought for a breath of air near the hatches, for a drop of water, for a space to sit. Those who collapsed were trampled. Disease spread faster than speech. Dysentery, dehydration, and madness took hold. Inside, it was not a voyage. It was slow-motion murder. The worst crime was not only the cruelty inside the ships, but what happened outside them. Under the Geneva Convention, Japan was required to mark any transport carrying POWs with a red cross or white flag, but the Japanese commanders refused. Why? Because they feared Allied attacks. They believed that if they revealed the presence of prisoners, the ships would be targeted anyway. Or worse, that they would lose the ability to secretly move troops and equipment alongside them. So the ships sailed unmarked. No red crosses, no warnings, no mercy. To Allied submarines and bombers, they looked like ordinary enemy transports, legitimate targets in a war of total destruction. The prisoners didn't know it, but the moment they boarded those ships, their fate was sealed. Every rumble of an engine, every distant explosion could mean death. Some prayed that Allied forces would find and free them. Others whispered the truth, that their own side would kill them without ever knowing. As the convoys left Manila, Singapore, and Borneo, the sea itself became a graveyard waiting to be filled. What began as transport soon turned into one of the least-known massacres of the Second World War, a tragedy hidden under the waves for decades. By the time the war ended, more than 20,000 Allied prisoners would vanish at sea, drowned, burned, or suffocated in the darkness of those ships. But their story didn't end there, because the world didn't even know it had happened. The journey inside a Japanese hellship was not measured in miles. It was measured in screams. For the prisoners, time lost all meaning once the hatch closed. The air below deck thickened almost instantly. Men gasped and coughed, clawing for oxygen. The temperature rose past human limits. It was a steel coffin, sealed under the tropical sun. The darkness was total. In the belly of the ship, 1,000 men were crammed into spaces smaller than a train carriage. The only light came from cracks in the wooden planks or from the faint orange glow of torches when guards briefly opened the hatch to throw down rice or water. There was no air circulation, no toilets, no room to lie down. Buckets overflowed. The floor became a swamp of filth. The stench was unbearable, a mix of sweat, excrement, vomit, and decay. Some prisoners tried to fan others with scraps of clothing, hoping to keep them from suffocating. Others simply closed their eyes and waited to die. Survivors later said that the worst torture was not the beatings, but the air. Men fought for places near the ventilation grates. Those near the center of the hold sometimes never woke up. If someone fainted, there was no room to move the body. They died standing, pressed upright by the crowd. When the hatch opened for food or water, prisoners screamed for air, climbing over each other, desperate to reach the surface. Guards responded with clubs and rifle butts, beating them back into the dark. Inside, men began to go mad. Some hallucinated the sound of rain or waves, imagining they could drink. Others tore at the walls or tried to break through the steel with bare hands. After just a few days, disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery, cholera, and dehydration claimed dozens every day. The bodies were stacked near the hatch, waiting to be taken out, but often left for days. When guards finally opened the hatch, they dragged the corpses up and threw them overboard, one by one like garbage. The ocean swallowed them silently, and the hatches slammed shut again. Each day blurred into the next. Some prisoners scratched messages into the metal, names, prayers, or words like, "Remember us." Others whispered hymns, trying to keep their sanity as the ship rolled endlessly across the Pacific. Even in this darkness, a few fragments of humanity survived. Some prisoners shared their last water with men worse off than themselves. One survivor recalled giving the final sip from his canteen to a stranger, saying, "If one of us lives, let him tell." But for most, there would be no story to tell. Above deck, Japanese soldiers walked casually, unaware or indifferent to what was happening below. To Allied submarines and bombers in the sky, the ships looked like normal cargo freighters. They had no Red Cross, no signal flags, nothing to show that beneath the steel decks were hundreds of Allied prisoners, slowly dying. The ocean stretched endlessly around them, blue, bright, and indifferent. No one on Earth knew that these ships carried human cargo. No one knew they were about to become floating tombs. By late 1944, dozens of these vessels had set sail across the Pacific. Some reached Japan, most did not. And when they were finally attacked, when the first torpedoes hit, the prisoners cheered, believing rescue had come. They didn't know that those explosions were the beginning of their final journey. By late 1944, the Pacific was crawling with American submarines and aircraft. Japan's supply routes were collapsing under constant assault. To the U.S. Navy, any Japanese transport was a target, a chance to choke the enemy's war machine. But no one in the Allied command knew that some of those enemy transports were filled with their own men, unmarked, hidden, doomed. From beneath the waves, submarine commanders watched convoys through periscopes, gray shapes moving across blue water. Each ship looked the same: freighters, tankers, escorts. They fired torpedoes, watching explosions bloom on the horizon, sending up columns of fire and smoke. To them, it was victory. To the men trapped below decks, it was hell's final chapter. Inside the holds, the prisoners heard the first blasts, like thunder rolling through metal. The ship shuddered, lights flickered, and pipes burst. At first, many cheered, believing the explosions meant rescue. They shouted, "The Americans found us! We're saved!" Then came the second explosion. The third. Steel plates ripped open, seawater flooded in, and panic turned to chaos. Men clawed toward the hatches, screaming. But the guards above had already locked them. The heat turned to cold as seawater rushed in. In the dark, prisoners trampled each other, trying to climb to the surface. One survivor said, "You could hear men praying, shouting, crying, and then silence, only the sound of water." Within minutes, entire ships vanished. Those who managed to break free from the holds surfaced amid oil, fire, and debris. The sea burned. Waves glowed with gasoline and floating corpses. Some prisoners floated on wreckage, watching planes circle overhead, not knowing if they were friend or foe. Others tried to swim toward other ships, only to be shot at by Japanese guards who feared escape. The Pacific swallowed them without distinction. Soldier, prisoner, captor, all the same in death. The earliest recorded tragedy was the Lisbon Maru, a British transport carrying over 1,800 prisoners from Hong Kong in 1942. It was torpedoed by an American submarine. The guards sealed the hatches. Most of the men drowned inside. Out of 1,816 prisoners, more than 800 died. The rest were machine gunned in the water or left to drift for days before fishermen pulled them out. And this was only the beginning. As the war went on, the attacks grew more frequent. Submarines scored more kills, unaware they were sinking ships full of their own. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had tightened its blockade so effectively that nearly every Japanese transport risked destruction. To the crews below, each explosion sounded like justice, until they realized it was their own death. Some shouted prayers for the pilots above. Others cursed them with their final breath. They were dying at the hands of men who thought they were saving them. When the smoke cleared, the ocean was calm again. Oil floated on the surface. So did bodies. Ships vanished beneath the waves, leaving no trace but bubbles and silence. These were the first of the ghost ships, vessels that carried human cargo into oblivion. And worse was yet to come, because the deadliest of them all, the airless Maru, was still waiting for its turn. On October 24, 1944, a Japanese transport named Arisan Maru left the Philippines, heading north toward Japan. On board were 1,775 American prisoners of war, survivors of Bataan, Corregidor, and countless island battles. They were exhausted, starving, many already sick. None of them knew that this voyage would be their last. The Arisan Maru was an old freighter, never meant to carry people. The prisoners were packed into 2 cargo holds deep inside the ship, spaces so tight that men could barely sit. The air was hot and foul. The only light came from the hatch above, which guards kept closed most of the time. Days passed in the dark. Men whispered prayers, shared drops of water, and tried to ignore the sound of rats scratching in the corners. They didn't know where they were going, only that they were being moved to Japan to work as slaves. Outside, the ship joined a Japanese convoy, escorted by destroyers and cargo vessels. But above them, unseen, an American submarine had already picked up the signal. At 5 p.m., Just as the sun began to set, torpedoes streaked through the water. Moments later, impact. The Arasan Maru shook violently. Inside the holds, men were thrown against the walls. The lights went out. Screams filled the darkness. A second explosion ripped open the hull. Seawater flooded in through the cracks. The ship began to list sharply to one side. At first, the prisoners cheered. They thought rescue had come. They shouted, "We're saved." The Americans found us. Then reality hit. The guards above were gone. The hatches were sealed. The water was rising fast. In the pitch-black hold, chaos exploded. Men clawed at the steel walls trying to break through. Some used wooden planks to smash at the hatch. Others tried to climb the slippery ladders, but fell back into the flooding water. A few managed to reach the deck, only to be shot by panicked guards. The rest were trapped below as the ship tilted farther, groaning under its own weight. One survivor later said, "We could hear the ocean coming for us." Men were praying, crying, calling for their mothers. Then the ship just stopped moving. And then it sank. Within minutes, 1,775 men were gone, swallowed by the dark sea. Only 9 survived. Those 9 survivors clung to floating debris through the night, surrounded by oil, fire, and corpses. They drifted for hours before being rescued by another Japanese ship, only to be thrown back into captivity. They were beaten, interrogated, and forced to work in coal mines until the end of the war. When the U.S. finally liberated Japan, only 5 of those 9 men were still alive. Their testimonies became the only voices left from the Arasan Maru. When the war ended, families back home waited for letters that never came. Months later, they received short official notes. "Your son is presumed dead while being transported aboard a Japanese vessel." No names of ships, no details, just silence. For years, the Arasan Maru was almost forgotten, a tragedy buried under the ocean and classified files. It was not until the 1950s that researchers uncovered the truth. The ship had been sunk by an American submarine, the USS Shark, which was itself destroyed days later. Neither side knew the other's fate. They both vanished beneath the same sea. The Arasan Maru became the symbol of all the lost ships, silent witnesses to a war that devoured its own. No wreck was ever officially found. No monument stands over the spot where nearly 2,000 men drowned. Only the waves remember. And the silence of the ocean still holds their names. When World War II ended, the world celebrated victory, parades, headlines, and flags waving in the wind. But beneath the noise of triumph, there were families who never received answers. Their sons, brothers, and fathers had vanished without a trace. Not in battle, not in prison, but somewhere at sea. No graves, no wrecks, no bodies, just silence. For the families of the Arasan Maru and dozens of other ghost ships, the news came in cold, bureaucratic language. The War Department regrets to inform you that your relative is presumed dead while being transported by the Japanese. That was it. No ship name, no location, no explanation. Some families didn't even receive that. They just stopped getting letters. Mothers kept the last postcards their sons had sent before capture. Wives waited for ships that would never arrive. And when they asked what happened, the answers were vague or classified. The truth was buried under layers of confusion, shame, and secrecy. Japan had destroyed most of its wartime transport records before surrendering, and the Allies, focused on rebuilding and avoiding scandal, didn't want the public to know that thousands of their own soldiers had been killed by their own side. It wasn't intentional, but it was devastating. The U.S. Navy had been hunting Japanese shipping with total success, but among those victories were tragedies no one could explain. To admit that Allied submarines had unknowingly killed Allied prisoners would have meant reopening wounds the world was desperate to close. In the years after the war, a few survivors began to speak. They told journalists about the hell ships, the heat, the disease, the screams, the torpedoes. At first, few believed them. The story sounded impossible, like nightmares too grotesque to be true. But slowly, evidence surfaced. Reports from Red Cross inspectors, intercepted Japanese radio messages, fragments of logbooks found in abandoned bases. Piece by piece, the scale of the horror became clear. More than 20,000 prisoners, Americans, British, Australians, and others, had died on these ships, and most of them had been killed not by execution, but by Allied attacks. Historians would later identify more than 50 major hell ship sinkings. Some of them, like the Oryoku Maru and Rakuyo Maru, were bombed or torpedoed while carrying thousands of prisoners. Each story was almost identical: overcrowded holds, unmarked ships, no warnings. And each time the survivors, if there were any, were forced back into captivity, beaten, and starved again. These ships had no names in the public record. They were listed as enemy vessels destroyed. In war reports, they were victories. Only decades later did people realize they were mass graves. Even among American veterans, the knowledge was unbearable. Some submarine commanders, when they later learned what they had done, refused to talk about it. One captain wrote in his journal, "We did everything right. We followed orders, and we killed our own." The war had blurred every moral line, and this was its cruelest proof. By the 1950s, the world had moved on. Japan was rebuilding, the U.S. was fighting a new war in Korea, and the Pacific had gone quiet again. The men lost on the hell ships were rarely mentioned. Their names were carved into a few memorials, small plaques in Manila, Australia, and Hawaii. But the sea that swallowed them remained unmarked. Families were told to be proud, but pride was a poor substitute for truth. The ocean kept it secret for decades. Only historians, divers, and a handful of survivors still remembered. The rest of the world forgot. And yet, under thousands of meters of water, the ships still lie there, silent, sealed with the screams of the men who died believing they were being saved. The Pacific Ocean is vast, more than 60 million square miles of shifting water. Somewhere beneath it, dozens of rusting wrecks still rest in darkness. The Arisan Maru, the Oryoku Maru, the Rakuyo Maru. Their steel hulls have become tombs, and the men who once filled them have become ghosts. For decades, their story drifted between history and myth, known only to survivors and a few determined researchers. But slowly, the truth began to surface. In the 1970s and 1980s, historians and divers started piecing together the lost convoys of the Japanese hell ships. Japanese archives released fragments of shipping logs. American naval records, long sealed, were declassified. What they revealed shocked even those who thought they already knew war's cruelty. The ocean had claimed more Allied prisoners in those holds than the atomic bombings, more than entire land campaigns. Each rediscovered wreck told the same story: unmarked vessels, locked hatches, silence. Divers who visited the site said the water was eerily still, the decks covered in coral, the outlines of hatches barely visible through the gloom. No remains could be seen, but the sense of presence was undeniable. Memorials began to appear, not grand monuments, but quiet stones in cemeteries and along coasts. In Manila, a plaque bears the names of thousands lost at sea. In Australia, veterans' families hold annual services for the Rakuyo Maru, and in the United States, survivors' descendants gather to read the names of those who never came home. They call them the men who drowned twice, once in the sea and again in memory. These ceremonies are not just for mourning, they're for remembering what happens when humanity disappears behind secrecy and pride. The story of the hell ships is not only about death, it's about blindness. The blindness of a system that valued secrecy over life. The blindness of war itself, where even victory can hide tragedy. It reminds us that in total war, no one truly wins. The soldiers who sank those ships believed they were saving lives. The captors believed they were serving their emperor. But in the end, both sides helped fill the same graves. The ocean does not care who was right. It only remembers who was lost. Today, sonar still finds traces of those ships, faint outlines on the seabed, scattered across thousands of miles. Each one holds a story unfinished, a letter undelivered, a life erased. And every ripple above them carries the same unspoken message. We were here. Don't forget us. The Pacific remains their grave and their witness. No monuments can match its silence. No words can truly describe the weight of what happened there. War often hides its greatest horrors beneath victory. The story of the ghost ships is not just about the cruelty of one nation, but the tragedy of all humanity, how fear, pride, and lies can turn the ocean itself into a graveyard. Those men never saw the end of the war they fought for. They never saw their homes, or the peace that followed. But their story lives on, whispered in the waves, a warning that truth, once buried, always finds a way to rise again.